Sarah Mitchell never imagined that bringing homemade cookies to her husband's workplace would put her at the center of a security breach that would test every ounce of courage she possessed. In a matter of hours, this elementary school teacher would transform from a worried wife into the unexpected guardian of classified military secrets, armed with nothing but her quick thinking and an unbreakable will to protect the people she loved. This is the true story of how one woman's ordinary day became an extraordinary test of human resilience, where split-second decisions meant the difference between life and death, and where the line between civilian and defender disappeared completely. Sarah Mitchell hummed softly as she carefully placed the last batch of chocolate chip cookies into the blue ceramic container that had been her grandmother's. The kitchen smelled like vanilla and warmth, the kind of comfort that made any house feel like home. Outside her window, the October morning was crisp and bright, with golden leaves dancing in the gentle breeze. She glanced at the clock on the microwave. 9:30 a.m. Perfect timing. Her husband Mark had been working double shifts at Fort Henderson for the past 3 weeks, and she could hear the exhaustion in his voice during their brief phone calls. As a communications specialist at the military base, he was part of a team responsible for maintaining secure channels between different departments. The work was important, but it was also demanding, especially during what Mark vaguely referred to as enhanced security protocols. Sarah understood that she couldn't know the details of his work. After 8 years of marriage to a military man, she had learned to read between the lines. When Mark came home with tense shoulders and distant eyes, she knew it had been a difficult day. When he worked late without explanation, she simply kept dinner warm and waited. But this stretch had been different. He seemed more worried than usual, checking his phone constantly and double-checking the locks on their doors before bed. The decision to surprise him with cookies wasn't just about being a thoughtful wife. Sarah had noticed that Mark had been losing weight, probably skipping meals again when work got intense. She packed the cookies alongside a thermos of his favorite coffee, dark roast with just a touch of cream, and added a sandwich she had made from leftover roast beef. If she couldn't take care of him at home, she could at least make sure he ate something decent during his shift. Fort Henderson was a 40-minute drive from their small suburban home. Sarah had only been to the base a handful of times over the years, usually for holiday parties or family events. Each visit required her to go through security checkpoints, show identification, and wait to be escorted to the appropriate building. The process was routine, but thorough, a reminder that Mark's workplace was unlike her own elementary school, where the biggest security concern was making sure the playground gate stayed latched. As she drove through the countryside toward the base, Sarah found herself thinking about her students. It was a teacher workday, which meant she had the rare luxury of a morning off. Her third graders were probably sleeping in or watching cartoons, blissfully unaware that their teacher was planning a surprise visit to a military installation. She smiled at the thought of telling them about it later, carefully editing out any details that might be inappropriate for 8-year-old ears. The landscape gradually changed as she approached Fort Henderson. Civilian neighborhoods gave way to open fields, then to the imposing fences and warning signs that marked the perimeter of the military base. Guard towers stood like sentinels against the blue sky, and she could see uniformed personnel moving with purpose along the visible pathways. Even from a distance, there was an unmistakable sense of order and vigilance that made her sit up straighter in her car. The main gate came into view, and Sarah joined the short line of vehicles waiting for clearance. She had called ahead to arrange the visit, following the procedures that Mark had taught her years ago. Her identification was ready, along with the visitor's pass that had been approved earlier that morning. The guard who approached her window was young, probably not much older than her students' older siblings, but his demeanor was professional and alert. After checking her documents and making a brief phone call, the guard directed her to a parking area near the main administrative building. The base was larger than she remembered, with numerous structures spread across carefully maintained grounds. Personnel moved between buildings with obvious familiarity, while a few other visitors like herself walked more slowly, clearly paying attention to signs and directions. Mark's office was located in Building C, a modest two-story structure that housed the communications department. Sarah had to check in with another security desk inside the building, where a friendly sergeant took her information and called to confirm her visit. While she waited, she observed the controlled bustle of military efficiency around her. People moved with purpose, spoke in measured tones, and maintained an awareness of their surroundings that felt both natural and deliberate. When Mark appeared at the security desk, his face lit up with genuine surprise and pleasure. He looked tired, she noticed, with dark circles under his eyes and a slight stoop to his usually straight posture. But his smile was real as he kissed her cheek and took the container of cookies from her hands. "You didn't have to drive all the way out here," he said, though his tone made it clear he was grateful she had. "Though I have to admit, the timing is perfect. We've been running on vending machine food for days." They walked together toward his department, Mark's hand resting lightly on her back in the protective gesture she had grown to love over their years together. The hallways were clean and utilitarian, with motivational posters and official notices posted on bulletin boards. The carpet was military-issue beige, and the lighting was the harsh fluorescent kind that made everyone look slightly pale. Mark's workspace was part of a larger room divided into cubicles, each equipped with multiple computer monitors and communication equipment that Sarah didn't recognize. His colleagues looked up as they passed, offering polite nods and brief smiles. She could sense their curiosity about her presence, but also their respect for Mark, evident in the way they greeted him and included him in their casual conversations. "Coffee break room is this way," Mark said, guiding her toward a small kitchen area at the far end of the building. "We can sit for a few minutes before I have to get back." The break room was simple but comfortable, with a few round tables, a refrigerator, and a coffee maker that looked like it had seen better days. Through the windows, Sarah could see a small courtyard with a few picnic tables where personnel sometimes ate lunch during good weather. Mark poured himself coffee from a thermos and bit into one of the cookies, closing his eyes briefly as he savored the familiar taste. "These are perfect," he said. "I didn't realize how much I needed something that tasted like home." They talked quietly for 20 minutes, Sarah sharing news about her students and their weekend plans, while Mark spoke carefully about his work, focusing on the general challenges rather than specific details. She could tell he was trying to appear more relaxed than he felt, but she didn't press him. In military families, there were always unspoken concerns that couldn't be addressed directly. As they talked, Sarah became aware of increased activity in the hallways outside the break room. Personnel were moving more quickly, and she could hear the sound of phones ringing more frequently than before. Mark noticed it too, his attention shifting toward the door even as he continued their conversation. "Probably just a drill," he said when she raised an eyebrow at the sudden bustle. "We've been having a lot of those lately." But something in his voice suggested he wasn't entirely convinced. When his supervisor appeared in the doorway of the break room, Mark immediately stood up, his posture shifting into the alert stance that Sarah recognized from his military training. "Mitchell, we need you back at your station," the supervisor said. His tone was calm, but urgent, the kind of controlled communication that suggested something important was happening. He glanced at Sarah with professional courtesy, but obvious impatience. "Of course, sir." Mark turned to Sarah, his expression apologetic but focused. "I am sorry, honey. Something's come up that I need to handle." Sarah gathered her purse and the empty thermos, understanding that her visit was over. But as they walked back toward the main area of the building, she noticed that the increased activity hadn't decreased. If anything, more personnel seemed to be moving with urgent purpose, and she could hear the crackling of radio communications from multiple directions. At the security desk where she needed to sign out, there was a brief delay. The sergeant who had checked her in was engaged in a quiet but intense conversation with someone on the phone, occasionally glancing at a computer screen that Sarah couldn't see. Mark waited with her, but she could sense his growing need to return to his duties. The conversation at the security desk continued for several minutes, with the sergeant asking questions and taking notes on a small pad. Other personnel passed through the area, some stopping to speak briefly with the sergeant before continuing on their way. The atmosphere had shifted from the controlled calm of routine operations to something more urgent, though still disciplined and professional. Finally, the sergeant hung up the phone and turned his attention back to Sarah and Mark. But instead of completing the routine sign-out process, he picked up another phone and dialed a short extension number. "Sir, we have a situation developing at the main gate," she heard him say quietly. "I'm going to need guidance on visitor protocols." Mark's expression grew serious, and Sarah felt a flutter of concern in her stomach. Whatever was happening, it was clearly more than a routine drill. She looked around the area and noticed that other visitors who had been present earlier were no longer visible. The building seemed to contain only essential personnel now. The sergeant finished his call and looked at them both with a professional but concerned expression. "Mrs. Mitchell, I'm going to need you to remain in the building for a short while. We're implementing temporary security measures that require all visitors to stay in designated areas until further notice." Sarah felt Mark's hand tighten slightly on her arm, a subtle gesture of protection and reassurance. She nodded her understanding, though her mind was racing with questions about what kind of situation required visitors to remain on base rather than leave immediately. "Is there somewhere comfortable she can wait?" Mark asked, his voice steady but protective. "The conference room down the hall is available," the sergeant replied. "We'll make sure she has everything she needs." But before they could move toward the conference room, the building's public address system crackled to life, and a calm but authoritative voice filled the hallways. "Attention, all personnel. We are now implementing code yellow security protocols. All non-essential personnel report to designated safe areas immediately." This is not a drill. Sarah looked at Mark, seeing her own concern reflected in his eyes. Code yellow meant something significant was happening, something that required the military to shift into protective mode. As if to emphasize the seriousness of the situation, they could hear vehicles moving rapidly outside the building, and radio chatter seemed to increase in both volume and urgency. "What does code yellow mean?" Sarah asked quietly. Mark hesitated for a moment, clearly weighing how much he could explain. "It means there's a potential security threat that requires heightened precautions. Everyone follows specific protocols to ensure safety while the situation is assessed and addressed." His explanation was careful and general, but Sarah could read the tension in his posture and the way his eyes kept moving toward the windows and exits. Whatever was happening, it was serious enough to make her experienced military husband worried, and that made her worried too. The sergeant was now coordinating with multiple people, both on the phone and through his radio. Other personnel moved through the area with obvious purpose, some carrying equipment, others consulting documents or computer screens. The atmosphere was becoming increasingly focused and urgent, though still maintaining the discipline that characterized military operations. Sarah found herself thinking about her students and her normal Tuesday routine. An hour ago, her biggest concern had been whether the cookies would stay fresh during the drive to the base. Now she was standing in a military facility under some kind of security alert, watching her husband prepare for duties she didn't understand while being told she couldn't leave. The irony wasn't lost on her that in trying to take care of Mark, she had somehow placed herself in a position where he would now be worried about taking care of her. But as she watched him interact with his colleagues and respond to the evolving situation, she felt a surge of pride at his professionalism and competence, even as she wished she was safely at home grading papers. The conference room where Sarah was directed to wait was sterile and windowless, furnished with a long table surrounded by cushioned chairs and a whiteboard covered with faded marks from previous meetings. Emergency lighting cast everything in a slightly harsh glow, making the beige walls seem even more institutional than they already were. She sat facing the door, her purse clutched in her lap, trying to process the rapid change from pleasant surprise visit to mandatory confinement. Through the closed door, she could hear increased radio chatter and the sound of boots moving quickly across the linoleum floors. The voices were too muffled to make out specific words, but the tone was unmistakably urgent. Every few minutes, someone would hurry past the door, their shadow briefly blocking the light that seeped in from the hallway. 20 minutes passed before anyone came to check on her. It was a young woman in military fatigues, probably in her mid-20s, with short brown hair and kind eyes that couldn't quite hide her own tension about the situation. "Mrs. Mitchell? I'm Corporal Anderson. I want to make sure you're comfortable and see if you need anything, water, something to eat." Sarah shook her head, then immediately changed her mind. "Actually, water would be nice. And maybe you could tell me what's happening? I understand if you can't share details, but my husband is Mark Mitchell in communications, and I'm starting to worry." Corporal Anderson's expression softened with understanding. "I can tell you that we're dealing with a security situation that requires everyone to follow safety protocols. Your husband's department is essential personnel, so he's exactly where he needs to be. The best thing you can do right now is stay here where we know you're safe." She left to get water, and Sarah found herself alone again with her growing anxiety. The phrase security situation could mean anything from a suspicious vehicle at the gate to something far more serious. She thought about calling her sister or her principal to let them know she might be late, but her cell phone had no signal inside the building. The military base was probably designed to block unauthorized communications. She realized, another reminder of how different this world was from her own. When Corporal Anderson returned with a bottle of water and a package of crackers, the sounds from the hallway had changed. Instead of scattered activity, there was now a steady stream of movement, and she could hear what sounded like equipment being moved or set up nearby. "Corporal," Sarah said as the young woman prepared to leave again, "is my husband in danger?" The question hung in the air between them, and Sarah could see the internal struggle on Anderson's face between providing reassurance and maintaining operational security. Finally, the corporal sat down across from her at the conference table. "Mrs. Mitchell, I can't give you specific details about the situation, but I can tell you that this facility has extensive security measures and highly trained personnel. Everyone here, including your husband, is working to ensure that any threat is contained and neutralized quickly." The word threat made Sarah's stomach clench. Until now, she had been thinking in terms of security drills or routine precautions. But Corporal Anderson had just confirmed that there was an actual threat of some kind, something real enough to lock down the entire base. "How long do these situations usually last?" Sarah asked, trying to keep her voice steady. "It varies," Anderson replied honestly. "Sometimes it's resolved quickly. Sometimes it takes longer. The important thing is that everyone follows protocols and stays where they're supposed to be until we know it's safe." After the corporal left, Sarah tried to distract herself by thinking about anything other than her current situation. She mentally reviewed lesson plans for the rest of the week, thought about the grocery shopping she needed to do, even considered the book she had been reading before bed. But her mind kept returning to Mark and whatever was happening outside the confines of this windowless room. The next interruption came in the form of alarms. Not the piercing, panic-inducing kind she might have expected, but a steady, authoritative tone that seemed to pulse through the entire building. Following the alarms, the public address system crackled to life again. "Attention, all personnel. We are now implementing code red security protocols. All personnel remain in designated secure areas. Security teams respond to stations immediately." Sarah's heart began to race. If code yellow had been serious, code red sounded terrifying. She stood up and moved toward the door, not to leave, but to see if she could hear anything that might give her more information. The hallway outside was now filled with constant activity, and she could hear radio communications that sounded increasingly urgent. Someone knocked on the conference room door, and Sarah quickly returned to her seat. But instead of Corporal Anderson, a tall man in military uniform entered. His name tag read Captain Torres, and his expression was grave but controlled. "Mrs. Mitchell, I need to speak with you about the current situation." Sarah's mouth went dry. When a captain came to talk to a visitor during a security emergency, it usually meant something significant had changed. "Is Mark all right?" she asked immediately. "Your husband is safe and performing his duties," Captain Torres replied, taking a seat across from her. "But I need to inform you that we're dealing with a more serious situation than initially assessed. There's been a breach of our perimeter security, and we have reason to believe that hostile individuals have gained access to base grounds." The words hit Sarah like a physical blow. Hostile individuals. People who meant harm had somehow gotten onto a military base where her husband worked, where she was now trapped. "What does that mean for me?" she asked, surprised by how steady her own voice sounded. "It means we need to move you to a more secure location within the building," Captain Torres explained. "The conference room you're in now is too close to exterior walls and main hallways. We're going to relocate you to an interior office that's better protected." They moved quickly through hallways that were now bustling with purposeful activity. Sarah saw personnel carrying weapons, setting up equipment she didn't recognize, and speaking in her radios with clipped professional urgency. Through windows, she glimpsed vehicles moving rapidly across the base grounds and figures in tactical gear taking positions around buildings. The office where they relocated her was smaller than the conference room, with no windows at all and what appeared to be reinforced walls. It contained a desk, 2 chairs, and filing cabinets, along with a computer terminal that had been turned off. Captain Torres showed her how to lock the door from the inside and gave her a radio set to a specific frequency. "If anything happens, if you hear sounds that concern you, if anyone tries to enter this room who doesn't identify themselves properly, you use this radio to contact security immediately," he told her. "The call sign is Sanctuary. Just press this button and say Sanctuary requesting immediate assistance, followed by your location, which is Building C, Room 237. Sarah stared at the radio in her hands, trying to comprehend that she was being given emergency communication equipment because there was a real possibility she might need to call for help. "Captain, what exactly are we dealing with here?" she asked. "Are these terrorists? Military enemies? What do they want?" Torres hesitated, clearly weighing how much information to share with a civilian. "We believe it's a coordinated group attempting to access classified information. Their exact objectives are still being assessed, but they've demonstrated knowledge of base layout and security procedures that suggest significant planning." After he left, locking the door behind him, Sarah found herself in complete silence for the first time since the alarms began. The interior office was insulated from most of the sounds that had been filtering through the conference room, leaving her alone with her thoughts and the weight of what she had just learned. Professional criminals or terrorists had breached Fort Henderson security and were somewhere on the base grounds looking for classified information. Mark and his colleagues in the communications department would have access to exactly the kind of sensitive data that such people might be seeking. The realization made her feel sick with worry. She tried to imagine what Mark was doing right now. Was he helping to secure information systems? Was he in physical danger? Did he know that she was still on base? Or was he assuming she had left safely before the situation escalated? Time became elastic in the windowless room. Without being able to see outside or hear most of what was happening, Sarah lost track of how long she sat there, holding the emergency radio and listening to her own breathing. Occasionally, she could hear footsteps in the hallway outside, but they always passed by without stopping. The radio in her hands remained silent, which she hoped was a good sign. If security forces needed to contact her, it probably meant something had gone wrong. As long as she heard nothing, she could tell herself that the situation was being handled by people who knew what they were doing. But her imagination was working overtime, creating scenarios that ranged from mildly concerning to absolutely terrifying. What if the intruders had weapons? What if they took hostages? What if they succeeded in accessing classified information that could endanger other military personnel or operations? She thought about her students, who would be expecting her back in school tomorrow morning. She thought about her sister, who was probably going about her normal Tuesday routine with no idea that Sarah was locked in a military base during a security crisis. She thought about the lesson she had planned to teach about community helpers and how she had never fully appreciated the complexity and danger that some of those helpers faced every day. The silence was broken by sounds that made her blood run cold. Somewhere in the building, she could hear shouting. Not the controlled communication she had been hearing earlier, but actual shouting that suggested conflict or emergency. Following the shouting, she heard what sounded like running footsteps and doors slamming. Sarah clutched the radio tighter, her finger hovering over the button that would connect her to security. But she hesitated, unsure whether what she was hearing constituted the kind of emergency that warranted breaking radio silence. The sounds continued for several minutes before fading away, leaving her even more anxious than before. Then, she heard something that made her decision for her, the unmistakable sound of gunfire. It was distant, but definitely real, the sharp crack of weapons being fired somewhere within the base complex. Her hands shaking, she pressed the button on the radio. Sanctuary requesting immediate status update. She said, "Try to remember the proper protocol. This is Building C, Room 237. The response came immediately. "Sanctuary, this is base security. Remain in your current location. Do not leave the room under any circumstances. Situation is being contained." The radio fell silent again, but now Sarah knew that whatever was happening was serious enough to involve weapons. She tried to tell herself that it could be security forces neutralizing the threat, that the gunfire didn't necessarily mean anyone had been hurt. But the sound of weapons being fired inside a building where her husband worked was terrifying regardless of the circumstances. More time passed, though she couldn't tell how much. The silence was occasionally broken by distant sounds that she couldn't identify, voices, footsteps, mechanical noises that might have been equipment or vehicles. Each sound made her jump, her nerves stretched to the breaking point by the combination of isolation and uncertainty. When the door handle turned, Sarah's heart nearly stopped. She had been told that no one should be trying to enter the room without proper identification, and she hadn't heard anyone approach in the hallway. Gripping the radio in one hand, she backed away from the door and prepared to make an emergency call. But the voice that came through the door was familiar and welcome. "Sarah, it's me. It's Mark." She rushed to unlock the door, relief flooding through her as she saw her husband's familiar face. But her relief was tempered by his appearance. Mark looked exhausted and stressed, with dirt on his uniform and a small cut on his forehead that hadn't been there when she saw him earlier. "Are you hurt?" she asked immediately, reaching toward the cut on his face. "I'm fine," he said, pulling her into a quick, fierce hug. "But we need to move. The situation has changed, and this location is no longer secure." Before Sarah could ask what he meant, Mark was already guiding her toward the door, his manner urgent but controlled. As they stepped into the hallway, she could see that the building had been transformed. Personnel were moving with obvious haste, carrying equipment and documents. Some doors that had been open earlier were now closed and marked with security tape. "What happened?" she asked as they walked quickly toward an exit she hadn't used before. "The intruders got farther into the facility than initially believed," Mark replied, his voice tight with controlled tension. "They've accessed areas that put civilian visitors at risk. We're evacuating all non-essential personnel to a secure location off base." As they reached the exit, Sarah could see vehicles waiting outside with engines running. Other people were already climbing into them. She recognized some as visitors she had seen earlier in the day. Military personnel were directing the evacuation with efficient urgency, checking names against lists and ensuring everyone was accounted for. But as they approached one of the vehicles, an explosion somewhere on the base grounds shook the building behind them. Sarah stumbled, catching herself against Mark's arm as debris fell from the sky around them. In the distance, she could see smoke rising from what appeared to be another building entirely. "Change of plans," shouted one of the military personnel coordinating the evacuation. "Perimeter is compromised. All civilians to the emergency bunker immediately." Instead of getting into the evacuation vehicles, they were now being directed back into the building, but toward a section Sarah hadn't seen before. As they hurried through corridors that seemed to stretch deeper into the base's interior, she realized that what had started as a security incident was evolving into something much more dangerous. The emergency bunker was located 3 levels underground, accessible only through a series of security doors that required multiple authorization codes. As the group of evacuated civilians descended, Sarah could hear the sounds of the crisis above growing more distant, replaced by the hum of ventilation systems and emergency lighting. The bunker itself was larger than she had expected, designed to house essential personnel during extended emergencies. Mark stayed with the civilian group long enough to ensure Sarah was settled, but his radio was constantly crackling with communications from his department. She could see the conflict in his eyes, his duty to his job versus his desire to protect her personally. "I have to go back up," he told her quietly, taking her hands in his. "Communications is essential during a crisis like this, but you'll be safe down here. The bunker is designed to withstand almost anything, and there are security personnel assigned specifically to protect civilians." Sarah nodded, understanding even as she hated the idea of him returning to danger. "Do what you need to do. I'll be fine." But within an hour of Mark's departure, it became clear that the situation above ground was deteriorating rapidly. The security personnel in the bunker received constant updates through their communication equipment, and while they tried to keep the information from civilians, Sarah could pick up fragments of radio chatter that painted an increasingly grim picture. The intruders had not only breached the base perimeter, but had taken control of several key buildings, including parts of the communications center where Mark worked. They appeared to be well-equipped and highly trained, suggesting this was not a random attack, but a carefully planned operation targeting specific military assets. Corporal Anderson, who had been assigned to help manage the civilian evacuees, found Sarah sitting near the radio equipment, straining to hear news about what was happening above. "Mrs. Mitchell, I know this is incredibly difficult, but you need to try not to listen to operational communications," Anderson said gently. "The information is often preliminary and can be misleading." "My husband is up there," Sarah replied, not moving away from the radio. "I need to know what's happening." Anderson sat down beside her, her own expression showing the strain of the extended crisis. "I understand, but I can tell you that the communications department has some of the best security protocols on the base. Your husband and his colleagues are trained for situations like this." Before Sarah could respond, alarms began sounding in the bunker itself. These were different from the alerts she had heard earlier. Sharper, more urgent, designed to cut through any other noise and demand immediate attention. Security personnel throughout the bunker immediately moved to defensive positions, speaking rapidly into their radios. The security chief, a grizzled sergeant major named Rodriguez, addressed the room with the kind of calm authority that came from decades of military experience. "Ladies and gentlemen, we've received information that hostile forces may attempt to access this bunker. While this facility is extremely secure, we're implementing additional protective measures. Please remain calm and follow all instructions from security personnel." Sarah felt her world tilt. The emergency bunker, designed to be the safest place on the base, was now potentially under threat. If the intruders were trying to reach them here, it meant they had gained access to information about the bunker's existence and location. It also meant that whatever was happening above ground was far worse than anyone had initially realized. Over the next 2 hours, the situation continued to escalate. Radio reports indicated that the intruders had superior knowledge of base layout and security systems, suggesting inside information or extensive reconnaissance. Several buildings had been damaged by explosives, and there were reports of casualties among both military personnel and civilian contractors. Most concerning for Sarah was the intermittent loss of communication with the surface. The bunker systems were designed to maintain contact even during emergencies, but something was interfering with their ability to receive and send messages. Without reliable communication, They had no way of knowing the current status of the crisis or when it might be safe to leave their underground shelter. It was during one of these communication blackouts that they heard the sounds that changed everything. Metal clanging against the reinforced doors of the bunker, followed by mechanical sounds that suggested someone was attempting to breach the entry points. The sounds were methodical and persistent, indicating that whoever was outside had both the tools and the knowledge necessary to attempt forced entry. Sergeant Major Rodriguez gathered his security team and spoke in low, urgent tones. Sarah couldn't hear their conversation, but she could see the seriousness in their body language. One of the team members began distributing additional equipment, while another started repositioning furniture to create more defensible positions within the bunker. Mrs. Mitchell, Rodriguez approached her directly, his expression grave but controlled. "I need to speak with you privately." He led her to a small office area within the bunker, closing the door behind them. When he spoke, his voice was quiet but direct. "Your husband's department handles communication systems that include access codes for various base functions, including this bunker. If the intruders have compromised that information, they may be able to access areas that should be impossible to reach." Sarah felt cold understanding wash over her. "You're saying they might be able to get in here. I'm saying we need to be prepared for that possibility. This bunker has additional security features that can only be activated from the inside, but doing so would cut off all communication with the outside and lock us in here for an extended period." The implications were staggering. If they activated the bunker's maximum security features, they would be completely cut off from the outside world, with no way of knowing when it would be safe to emerge. But if they didn't activate those features and the intruders succeeded in breaching the bunker, everyone inside would be at their mercy. "What do you need from me?" Sarah asked, surprising herself with how steady her voice sounded. Rodriguez looked at her with something approaching respect. "Your husband's work gives you more familiarity with military communication systems than most civilians. I may need someone who can operate backup communication equipment if we lose our primary operators to defensive duties." The sound at the bunker entrance grew more intense, accompanied now by what sounded like power tools. Whoever was trying to get in was making steady progress, despite the facility's impressive security measures. Throughout the main area of the bunker, civilians huddled together while security personnel prepared for what was beginning to look like an inevitable confrontation. Sarah found herself thinking about her normal Tuesday routine, which seemed to belong to someone else's life now. This morning, she had been worried about whether her students would remember to bring their permission slips for next week's field trip. Now she was in an underground military bunker, listening to hostile forces attempt to break in while considering whether she could operate emergency communication equipment during what might be a life-or-death situation. The first breach came without warning. One moment, the bunker's entry alarms were sounding steadily, and the next, they could hear voices echoing through the facility's upper levels. The intruders had succeeded in getting past the outer security doors and were now inside the bunker complex itself. Rodriguez and his team took defensive positions while the civilians were moved to the most secure area of the facility. Sarah found herself crouched behind a bank of communication equipment, her hands shaking as she tried to follow the quick instructions Rodriguez had given her about operating the backup radio systems. The voices grew closer, and she could hear boot steps echoing through the corridors that led to their location. These weren't the organized, disciplined sounds of military personnel, but something more chaotic and urgent. Whoever these people were, they were moving with the confidence of people who believed they had the upper hand. When the first intruder appeared at the entrance to their section of the bunker, Sarah got her first clear look at what they were facing. The man was dressed in military-style clothing, but without proper insignia, carrying weapons that looked professional, but not standard issue. His face was covered by a tactical mask, but his body language suggested someone comfortable with violence. The firefight that followed was brief, but intense. Rodriguez and his security team were outnumbered but had the advantage of defensive positions and superior training. The confined space of the bunker made tactics more important than numbers, and the security personnel used their knowledge of the facility to maximum advantage. But during the confusion of the fight, Sarah realized that one of the intruders had managed to slip past the main confrontation and was moving toward the communication equipment where she was hiding. Her training as a teacher had never covered situations like this, but her instinct to protect others kicked in with surprising force. The intruder was focused on the main communication console, apparently trying to access information or disable the facility's ability to contact the outside world. He hadn't noticed Sarah behind the backup equipment, giving her a few crucial seconds to act. Without really thinking about what she was doing, Sarah grabbed the emergency radio she had been taught to operate and switched it to what Rodriguez had told her was the general emergency frequency. In her loudest, clearest teacher voice, the one she used to get attention during fire drills, she began broadcasting. "This is Fort Henderson Emergency Bunker requesting immediate assistance. We have hostile intruders in the facility. Multiple civilians at risk. Security team engaged. Send backup immediately." The intruder spun toward her, raising his weapon, but the damage was already done. Her broadcast had gone out on emergency frequencies that would be monitored by multiple agencies and military units. Even if the intruders succeeded in taking control of the bunker, help would know exactly where to find them. What happened next was a blur of movement and noise. The intruder lunged towards Sarah, apparently intent on stopping her from making any further broadcasts. But Rodriguez had heard her transmission and was already moving to intercept, despite being engaged with other hostiles in a different part of the bunker. The confrontation lasted only seconds, but it felt like hours. Sarah found herself pressed against the communication equipment, watching two people fight over whether she would live or die. The intruder was younger and possibly stronger than Rodriguez, but the sergeant major had decades of combat experience and an absolute determination to protect the civilians under his care. When additional security personnel arrived, responding to Sarah's emergency broadcast, they found the bunker secure and the immediate threat neutralized. But the larger crisis was far from over. Sarah's radio call had not only summoned help to their location, but had also provided crucial intelligence about the nature and extent of the attack on Fort Henderson. The information that the emergency bunker had been compromised told military commanders that the intruders had access to highly classified base security information. This realization triggered additional security protocols and brought federal law enforcement and military specialists to the base in unprecedented numbers. Over the following hours, Sarah remained in the bunker as the situation above ground was slowly brought under control. The attack, as it turned out, had been carried out by a sophisticated criminal organization with connections to foreign intelligence services. They had been seeking access to communication codes and encryption technology that could be sold to hostile nations or terrorist groups. The fact that they had nearly succeeded in accessing the base's most secure facilities was a sobering reminder of the ongoing threats faced by military personnel and the civilians who supported them. Sarah's quick thinking with the emergency radio had not only potentially saved lives in the bunker, but had also provided crucial information that helped security forces understand the full scope of the threat they were facing. When Mark finally made it down to the bunker, hours after the immediate crisis had passed, Sarah was still sitting beside the communication equipment. Her hands had stopped shaking, but she was still processing the reality of what she had experienced. The elementary school teacher who had come to deliver cookies to her husband had somehow become part of the base's last line of defense during a coordinated attack. "I heard about what you did," Mark said quietly, sitting down beside her on the floor of the bunker. "Rodriguez told me you probably saved lives with that radio call." Sarah looked at him, seeing pride mixed with concern in his expression. "I just did what needed to be done, like you taught me. In an emergency, the most important thing is clear communication." They sat together in the artificial light of the emergency bunker, surrounded by the controlled chaos of military personnel managing the aftermath of a crisis. Outside, Fort Henderson was slowly returning to normal operations, but Both of them knew that this day had changed them in ways they were only beginning to understand. For Sarah, it was a stark introduction to the reality of the threats that Mark faced in his work every day. For Mark, it was proof that the woman he had married possessed reserves of courage and quick thinking that even he hadn't fully appreciated. When they were finally cleared to leave the bunker and return to the surface, the sun was setting over Fort Henderson. The base showed signs of the day's crisis. Emergency vehicles, additional security personnel, and the kind of heightened alert status that would probably continue for days. But it was functioning, secure, and safe. As they drove home together, Sarah found herself thinking about her students again. Tomorrow, she would return her classroom and her normal routine, but she would do so with a deeper appreciation for the complexity of the world around them. She would also return with the knowledge that when faced with a genuine emergency, she had responded with courage and effectiveness. The cookies she had brought that morning were long forgotten, probably still sitting in Mark's office or destroyed during the security response. But the intention behind them, the desire to take care of someone she loved, had led to an experience that neither of them would ever forget. In the weeks that followed, Sarah would receive recognition from military officials for her actions during the crisis. But more importantly, she had gained a new understanding of herself and her own capabilities. The routine visit to see her husband had indeed transformed her, though not in any way she could have imagined when she first decided to surprise him with homemade cookies on what had seemed like an ordinary Tuesday morning.